Our mother made us promise never to look for our father, but when we found him, we finally understood why. The phone call came at 3:17 a.m., jolting me awake with a sound I'd never heard before. My mother screaming, not crying or upset, but raw, primal terror that made my blood freeze. Through the static and her gasping breaths, I caught fragments. He found us, and the symbols, and you have to run. The line went dead before I could ask what was happening. When I tried calling back, her phone went straight to voicemail. Daniel was already pulling on clothes when I pounded on his apartment door, his face grim as I explained the call. We'd been living in the same complex since college, close enough to look out for each other, but nothing had prepared us for this moment. The drive to our mother's house took 12 minutes that felt like hours, both of us silent as we processed what we might find. Her front door was hanging open, security chain dangling broken, and the living room looked like a tornado had torn through it. Furniture overturned, family photos scattered across the floor with their glass frames shattered, and on the white wall above the couch, someone had painted a symbol in what looked like dried blood, a circle with intersecting lines that hurt to look at directly. My brother Daniel found our mother's cell phone smashed in the kitchen sink, along with her laptop computer that had been deliberately destroyed with what looked like a hammer. The refrigerator door hung open, revealing that someone had methodically emptied every container and bottle onto the floor, creating a sticky mess that crunched under our feet. But it was the basement that made us both freeze in absolute horror. The concrete walls were covered floor to ceiling with photographs, hundreds of them showing Daniel and me at different ages, walking to school, playing in parks, sleeping in our beds. Someone had been watching us our entire lives, documenting every moment with the patience of a predator. In the center of one wall, written in the same dark substance as the symbol upstairs, were the words, "My sons will come home." Below that, an address in Oregon and a date, tomorrow's date. Our mother was nowhere to be found, but a trail of her blood led from the living room to the back door, where tire tracks in the mud showed a large vehicle had been parked. We called 911, but even as we spoke to the dispatcher, we both knew the police wouldn't be fast enough to save her. The detective who arrived an hour later listened to our story with growing skepticism, taking notes as we explained about our mother's warnings and the research we'd done about our father. Detective Rivers was a tired-looking woman in her 40s who'd clearly seen enough missing person cases to recognize the patterns, but she kept asking why we thought this was connected to a man our mother claimed to have left 30 years ago. When we showed her the basement filled with surveillance photos, her expression changed completely. She called for a forensics team and started making phone calls to federal agencies, her voice dropping to urgent whispers as she described what they'd found. While we waited for backup to arrive, she pulled us aside and explained that cults and extremist religious groups were a growing concern for law enforcement, especially those that had gone underground after initial investigations. She warned us that if our father was still active and had taken our mother, going to Oregon would likely be walking into a trap designed specifically for us. But she also admitted that standard police procedures moved slowly, and our mother might not have time for bureaucratic protocols to play out. The forensic team photographed everything, but they moved with methodical precision that made clear they were treating this as a crime scene rather than an emergency rescue situation. Daniel made the decision for both of us, while I was still trying to process the detective's warnings. He grabbed my arm and steered me toward his car, saying we couldn't wait for the system to save our mother when every hour might be her last. The drive to Oregon would take 8 hours if we drove straight through, and the address we'd found could be our only chance to find her before it was too late. Detective Rivers tried to stop us, warning that we were playing into our father's hands by responding exactly as he'd planned, but Daniel was already starting the engine. She pressed her business card into my hand and made me promise to call for backup the moment we had any information about our mother's location. As we pulled out of our mother's driveway, I looked back to see crime scene tape going up around the house where we'd spent countless holidays and family dinners. The last normal moment of our lives was disappearing in the rearview mirror, and we were driving toward a confrontation that had been building since before we were born. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and I could see him making the same calculation I was, that we'd rather die trying to save our mother than live, knowing we'd been too afraid to try. We made our first stop at a 24-hour Walmart outside Portland, where we bought camping supplies, first aid equipment, and prepaid cell phones that couldn't be traced back to our regular accounts. Daniel had the foresight to withdraw the maximum daily limit from 3 different ATMs, reasoning that we might need cash if we had to disappear quickly or pay someone for information. While he loaded supplies into the car, I researched the address we'd found, discovering that it led to a rural area in the Cascade Mountains where property records showed large parcels of land owned by something called the Eternal Foundation Trust. The satellite images showed clusters of buildings surrounded by forest, but the resolution wasn't good enough to reveal details about security or how many people might be living there. I found a local news article from 6 months earlier about mysterious lights and sounds coming from the area, with neighbors complaining that authorities refused to investigate despite repeated reports of suspicious activity. One resident was quoted saying that people who asked too many questions about what went on up in those mountains had a habit of suddenly deciding to move away or simply disappearing altogether. The final stretch of highway leading into the mountains was eerily empty, with no traffic in either direction and abandoned gas stations that looked like they'd been closed for years. We passed a checkpoint that appeared to be unmanned, though I noticed security cameras mounted on poles that tracked our vehicle as we drove past. The radio in Daniel's car gradually lost signal until we were driving in complete silence, with only the sound of our engine and the wind through the trees. My stomach clenched with each mile as we climbed higher into wilderness that seemed designed to swallow people without a trace. Cell phone coverage had disappeared completely, cutting off our last connection to the outside world and making me understand why our mother had sounded so terrified during her final call. Whatever waited for us at the end of this road existed in a place where normal rules and protections didn't apply, where our father could operate without interference from anyone who might try to help us. The Oregon address led us to a compound hidden deep in the Cascade Mountains, accessible only by a winding dirt road that hadn't appeared on any of the GPS systems we'd tried. We'd stopped for gas in the small town of Cedar Falls, where the elderly attendant's face had gone pale when we mentioned we were looking for the address. He'd warned us that people who went up that mountain road sometimes didn't come back down, and that the locals had learned not to ask too many questions about what happened in those woods. The man's hands had shaken as he counted our change, and he'd muttered something about how the whole town had been different since those people moved up into the hills. When Daniel pressed him for more details, the attendant glanced around nervously before explaining that the local economy had become dependent on the compound's residents, who paid premium prices for supplies and services, but expected absolute discretion in return. Anyone who violated that understanding found their businesses boycotted and their families subject to harassment that forced them to leave town. The message was clear. We were entering territory where our father's influence extended far beyond his immediate followers. The compound itself was larger than we'd expected, dozens of buildings scattered across a valley, with gardens and livestock areas that suggested a completely self-sufficient community. As we parked at the main gate, a group of people in simple white clothing emerged to greet us with unsettling calm, as if they'd been expecting our arrival. A woman with prematurely gray hair and serene eyes introduced herself as Sister Margaret and said that our father was eager to welcome us home after so many years of separation. The way she said home made my skin crawl, and I noticed that the other followers kept their distance but never stopped watching us with expressions of barely contained excitement. Sister Margaret's voice had the practiced cadence of someone who'd delivered this speech many times before, welcoming confused and frightened people into a world they didn't understand. She gestured for us to follow her through the gate, explaining that all weapons and electronic devices had to be surrendered for the spiritual protection of the community. When Daniel hesitated about giving up his phone, Sister Margaret's smile never wavered, but two large men in white clothing stepped forward with expressions that made clear this wasn't a request. Sister Margaret led us through the compound with the practiced efficiency of a tour guide, pointing out the various workshops where members created goods for sale, the school where children learned true knowledge, and the temple where the community gathered for daily spiritual instruction. Everything looked peaceful and well-maintained, but there were subtle details that felt wrong. Security cameras disguised as decorative elements, windows that had been barred from the outside, and the way conversations stopped whenever we approached groups of residents. The people we met seemed genuinely happy, but spoke in the rehearsed phrases of those who'd been trained never to express doubt or criticism. Children as young as 5 or 6 wore the same white clothing as the adults and responded to questions with quotes from what sounded like prepared scripts about spiritual purity and family loyalty. When Daniel asked about our mother, Sister Margaret's smile never wavered as she assured us that all family reunifications were handled personally by our father, who would explain everything during our private meeting. She led us to a guest house where we could rest and prepare for the encounter, though the locks on the doors only worked from the outside, and our cell phones had mysteriously stopped getting signal the moment we'd entered the compound grounds. The guest house was comfortable but clearly designed to be a holding area rather than genuine accommodation. The windows were fitted with locks that prevented them from opening more than a few inches, and the bathroom had no sharp objects or anything that could be used as a weapon. Daniel searched every inch of our room while I tried to process what we'd gotten ourselves into, both of us realizing that we'd walked willingly into exactly the trap Detective Rivers had warned us about. The furniture was bolted to the floor, and the electrical outlets had been sealed with permanent covers that would require tools to remove. A bookshelf held dozens of volumes about spiritual awakening and divine truth, all authored by someone named Samuel Thornfield, with photographs on the covers showing the same man whose image we'd found in the newspaper clippings. The books described a philosophy that mixed Christianity with New Age concepts and apocalyptic prophecies, creating a belief system that justified absolute obedience to Samuel's authority as the only path to salvation. Reading those pages made me understand how our mother had been drawn into something that had seemed benevolent before revealing its true nature. That evening, Sister Margaret returned with 2 sets of white clothing, identical to what all the residents wore, explaining that our father preferred meetings to take place in an atmosphere of spiritual purity. She mentioned that our mother was resting comfortably in the medical facility after her difficult journey, but that we wouldn't be able to see her until after we'd spoken with our father and demonstrated our commitment to the community's values. The implication was clear. Our mother's welfare depended on our cooperation, and any attempt to resist or escape would have consequences for all three of us. Sister Margaret also brought dinner on a tray, simple food that tasted slightly bitter in a way that made me wonder if it had been drugged with something to make us more compliant. Daniel managed to palm some of the bread without eating it, and we later tested it on a spider we found in the corner of our room. The spider's movements became sluggish within minutes, confirming our suspicions that the fellowship was using chemical methods to supplement their psychological manipulation techniques. We forced ourselves to stay awake through the night, taking turns keeping watch while the other dozed fitfully, afraid that sleep would leave us vulnerable to whatever Samuel had planned for our morning meeting. The temple where we met our father the next morning was an imposing structure built from local stone and timber, with stained glass windows that cast colored light across rows of wooden benches. Samuel Thornfield sat at the front of the room on what could only be described as a throne, carved from a single piece of dark wood and decorated with the same disturbing symbols we'd seen painted in our mother's house. He was older than in the newspaper photographs, his dark hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes held the same intense magnetism that had drawn followers to him decades earlier. When he spoke, his voice filled the space with practiced authority, welcoming us as his beloved sons, who had finally answered the call to return to their true family. He explained that our mother's departure had been necessary for our protection during our formative years, but that the time had come for us to take our rightful places as heirs to his spiritual mission. The way he talked about our lives as if they'd been orchestrated from birth made me understand why our mother had been so desperate to keep us hidden from him. Samuel's presence was genuinely compelling, and I could feel myself wanting to believe his words despite knowing rationally that he was a dangerous manipulator. Samuel's explanation of why he'd brought us home grew more disturbing as he continued speaking, describing a divine vision that had revealed our roles in the final phase of his spiritual work. According to his beliefs, the world was approaching a moment of cosmic transformation that would separate the enlightened from the damned, and our bloodline carried special significance in that process. He claimed that children born to spiritual leaders possessed enhanced abilities to communicate with divine forces, making us essential components in the rituals that would usher in a new age of human consciousness. Daniel and I exchanged glances as Samuel described ceremonies that sounded like nothing more than elaborate psychological manipulation designed to maintain his control over vulnerable people. But what truly chilled me was the realization that Samuel genuinely believed every word he was saying. This wasn't cynical exploitation, but the delusions of a man who'd convinced himself that his desire for power was actually divine will. When I asked about our mother's condition and when we could see her, Samuel's benevolent expression hardened for just a moment before he explained that family attachments were obstacles to spiritual growth that needed to be carefully managed through proper guidance. The tour of the compound that Samuel personally conducted revealed the true scope of his operation and the sophisticated methods he used to maintain absolute control over his followers. The residential areas were divided by family status and spiritual rank, with newer members living in dormitory-style buildings, while Samuel's inner circle enjoyed private homes closer to the temple. Children over the age of 7 were separated from their parents and housed in special education facilities where they received intensive instruction in the fellowship's beliefs and practices. Samuel explained that traditional family structures created conflicting loyalties that interfered with pure devotion to the spiritual community, so children were raised collectively by specially trained caregivers who could provide proper guidance. We passed workshops where members produced crafts and agricultural products that were sold in nearby towns, generating income that supported the compound's operations while giving followers a sense of purpose and accomplishment. The medical facility where our mother was supposedly recovering was heavily secured and off-limits to visitors, with armed guards who Samuel claimed were necessary to protect patients from the negative energy of the outside world. When Daniel pressed for more details about our mother's condition, Samuel's tone became subtly threatening as he suggested that doubt and questions were signs of spiritual contamination that required immediate treatment. The evening meal in the compound's central dining hall provided our first real opportunity to observe the fellowship's social dynamics and understand how Samuel maintained control over so many people. Hundreds of residents gathered for a communal dinner that began with extended prayers and readings from Samuel's writings, creating an atmosphere of shared ritual that reinforced group identity. The seating arrangements were clearly organized by status, with newer members relegated to tables furthest from where Samuel held court with his closest advisors. Children ate separately under the supervision of stern-faced adults who corrected their posture and monitored their conversations, ensuring that even casual interactions reinforced the community's hierarchical structure. Several times during the meal, individual members stood to confess doubts or mistakes they'd made, receiving public correction that combined humiliation with promises of forgiveness for those who demonstrated proper repentance. I noticed that many of the adults showed signs of chronic stress, weight loss, nervous tics, and the hollow-eyed appearance of people who'd been systematically deprived of sleep or privacy. When a young woman at our table mentioned missing her parents, Sister Margaret quickly steered the conversation toward how the fellowship provided better guidance than biological family members who lacked spiritual understanding. That night in our locked guest house, Daniel and I finally admitted to each other that we'd made a catastrophic mistake by coming to Oregon. The compound wasn't just a religious community, it was a sophisticated prison where Samuel used manipulation, isolation, and psychological abuse to maintain absolute control over hundreds of victims. Our mother hadn't been rescued. She'd been kidnapped and was being held as leverage to ensure our compliance with whatever Samuel had planned for us. The Fellowship of Eternal Light had never disbanded after the FBI investigation. It had simply moved deeper underground and become more careful about avoiding official scrutiny. As we tried to formulate an escape plan, we heard voices outside our window discussing security schedules and patrol routes, confirming that we were being watched constantly by guards who were prepared for the possibility that we might try to run. Our cell phones remained dead, and we realized that even if we could get past the guards, we had no way to call for help or navigate the mountain roads in the dark. The compound's isolation was complete, designed to make escape seem impossible, and submission the only rational choice for anyone who valued their survival. The next morning brought the revelation that would change everything we thought we understood about Samuel's motivations and our mother's past. Sister Margaret arrived with breakfast and casually mentioned that we'd be participating in a special ceremony that evening to formally welcome us into the fellowship's inner circle. She explained that our father had been preparing for this moment since our birth, and that the other community members were excited to witness the completion of a prophecy that had guided their spiritual work for nearly 3 decades. When Daniel asked what the ceremony involved, Sister Margaret's serene expression flickered with something that looked like pity before she explained that spiritual transformation required the willing sacrifice of old identities and attachments. She mentioned that our mother had undergone a similar process when she'd first joined the fellowship years ago, though she'd been too spiritually immature at the time to fully embrace the experience. The implication that our mother was about to be subjected to some kind of ritual abuse made both of us desperate to find her before Samuel's plans could be carried out. Sister Margaret also revealed that other families had been reunified through similar ceremonies over the years, with children who'd been taken from the compound as infants returning as adults to claim their spiritual inheritance. Our escape attempt that afternoon was both more and less successful than we'd hoped. Daniel managed to pick the lock on our guest house door using techniques he'd learned from YouTube videos, and we were able to slip out during a shift change when the guards were distracted. The compound was larger and more complex than we'd realized during our guided tour, with hidden tunnels and secondary buildings that weren't visible from the main pathways. We discovered an entire underground network of chambers and storage areas that suggested the fellowship had been preparing for some kind of siege or extended isolation from the outside world. Stockpiled food, weapons, and medical supplies filled room after room, along with communications equipment that looked sophisticated enough to monitor law enforcement frequencies. We found the medical facility after 20 minutes of careful searching, but the security was too tight for us to get inside without raising alarms that would alert the entire community. Through a window, we caught a glimpse of our mother lying motionless on a hospital bed, connected to IV tubes and surrounded by monitoring equipment that suggested she'd been heavily sedated or worse. Instead of attempting an immediate rescue that would likely fail, we focused on finding a way to communicate with the outside world, eventually locating a maintenance building that housed the compound's communication equipment. Daniel managed to send a brief emergency message to Detective Rivers using the facility's internet connection, providing our GPS coordinates and requesting immediate law enforcement intervention. But our success was short-lived. We were captured by guards who'd been tracking our movements through the compound's extensive surveillance network and brought before Samuel for what he called a teaching moment about the consequences of disobedience. Samuel's reaction revealed the depth of his narcissistic rage and the sophisticated monitoring systems he used to maintain control over every aspect of life in the compound. He'd been watching our escape attempt through hidden cameras from the moment we left our guest house, treating our desperate search for our mother as entertainment that proved his superiority over those who dared to challenge his authority. Rather than punishing us immediately, he announced that our behavior had demonstrated the corruption of our souls by outside influences, making it necessary to accelerate the purification process that would transform us into worthy successors to his spiritual mission. The guards who'd captured us were members of his inner circle who'd undergone years of conditioning to view Samuel's commands as divine law, making them willing participants in whatever violence he deemed necessary to maintain order. Samuel's reaction to our escape attempt revealed the full extent of his narcissistic rage and the lengths he would go to maintain control over people he considered his property. Rather than punishing us directly, he had our mother brought to the temple, where she was forced to kneel before his throne, while he explained how our actions had demonstrated that we were still contaminated by the selfish thinking of the outside world. Our mother looked terrible, thin, bruised, and wearing the blank expression of someone who'd been systematically broken through psychological torture. Her arms bore fresh needle marks that suggested she'd been kept compliant through forced medication, and she flinched whenever Samuel's voice rose above a whisper. Samuel announced that her suffering would continue until we proved our commitment to the fellowship by participating willingly in the evening ceremony, which he now revealed would involve permanent ritual scarification that would mark us as his spiritual successors. He claimed that the physical pain would purify our souls and bind us permanently to the community, making it impossible for us to ever leave or betray the sacred knowledge we would receive. The choice he presented was simple: submit to his authority completely, or watch our mother die slowly while we remained powerless to help her. The hours leading up to the ceremony passed with agonizing slowness as we were held in separate cells beneath the temple, each of us forced to contemplate Samuel's ultimatum without the comfort of each other's presence. My cell was tiny and windowless, with stone walls that wept moisture and a single bare bulb that provided harsh illumination around the clock. The psychological pressure was intense. Every few hours, one of Samuel's lieutenants would visit to describe in detail what would happen to our mother if we continued to resist, alternating threats with promises of the privileges we'd enjoy as members of the inner circle. They showed me photographs of previous ceremonies where young adults had been marked with symbols that covered their arms and faces, permanently identifying them as Samuel's property while supposedly connecting them to divine power. The scarification process looked excruciating, involving heated metal brands that would leave raised scars and intricate patterns across our skin. But what truly terrified me was the realization that Daniel and I weren't Samuel's first children to be brought back to the compound. Other families had gone through similar reunification processes over the years, with parents used as leverage to ensure their adult children's compliance with rituals that transformed them into unquestioning servants of Samuel's will. The ceremony began at sunset in the temple's main hall, with the entire fellowship community gathered to witness what Samuel proclaimed would be the fulfillment of divine prophecy. Daniel and I were dressed in ceremonial robes and positioned at the front of the room, surrounded by Samuel's most devoted followers who chanted in a language that sounded ancient but was probably invented specifically for these rituals. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and fear, as community members who'd never seen such a ceremony watched with fascination and horror at what was about to unfold. Samuel stood behind an altar covered with symbols and instruments that looked designed for torture rather than spiritual enlightenment, explaining to the assembled crowd that our willing participation would demonstrate the power of true faith over worldly attachments. Our mother was brought in wearing chains, her role in the ceremony apparently to serve as a witness to our transformation and a reminder of what would happen if we resisted. As Samuel began describing the specific mutilations that would be performed on us, I realized that this wasn't just psychological manipulation. He genuinely intended to physically mark us as his property in ways that would be visible for the rest of our lives. The crowd's excitement grew with each detail he revealed, their faces showing the glazed enthusiasm of people who'd been conditioned to view suffering as sacred when it served their leaders' purposes. The sound of helicopters approaching the compound interrupted Samuel's ceremonial preparations, and we could see the panic spreading through the fellowship as armed law enforcement officers surrounded the buildings. Detective Rivers had apparently taken our emergency message seriously enough to organize a multi-agency raid that included FBI agents specializing in cult deprogramming and hostage situations. Samuel's reaction was immediate and terrifying. He grabbed a ceremonial knife from the altar and held it to our mother's throat, screaming at his followers to barricade the doors and prepare for a siege that would prove their faith was stronger than government persecution. Chaos erupted as some community members tried to flee while others obeyed Samuel's commands to resist, creating a dangerous situation where any sudden movement could result in our mother's death. The law enforcement officers used bullhorns to demand Samuel's surrender, but he responded by claiming that divine forces had sent enemies to test the fellowship's resolve, and that martyrdom would guarantee their eternal salvation. Several of his inner circle produced weapons that had been hidden throughout the temple, transforming what had been a religious ceremony into an armed standoff with potentially dozens of casualties. The standoff lasted for 3 hours that felt like days, with Samuel alternately ranting about government conspiracies and whispering threats about what he would do to our mother if we made any attempt to signal the officers outside. Several fellowship members had already surrendered and been evacuated, but Samuel's inner circle remained loyal, apparently convinced that their leader's death would trigger some kind of spiritual transformation that would vindicate their years of sacrifice. As night fell, FBI negotiators tried to establish communication with Samuel, but he refused to engage in any discussions that didn't begin with acknowledgement of his divine authority. Our mother remained motionless in his grip, and I could see that she was fading from blood loss caused by the shallow cuts he'd been inflicting to demonstrate his control. Daniel and I were helpless to act without triggering a violent response that could end all 3 of our lives. trapped in a nightmare scenario where our father's madness had finally reached its logical conclusion. The temple had become a fortress where armed fanatics prepared to die rather than surrender their leader to authorities they'd been taught to view as agents of evil. While outside, law enforcement officers tried to find a way to end the crisis without massive bloodshed. The resolution came when Samuel's own paranoia turned against him. Convinced that some of his remaining followers were planning to betray him to the authorities, he began accusing his most loyal supporters of being government spies, planted to undermine his divine mission. Sister Margaret tried to reassure him of her devotion, but Samuel's grip on reality had completely snapped, and he turned the ceremonial knife on her instead of our mother. In the moment of confusion, as Sister Margaret fell bleeding to the floor, Daniel lunged forward and tackled Samuel, sending the knife sliding across the stone floor. I grabbed our mother and pulled her toward the temple's side door as FBI agents stormed into the main hall, shouting commands and taking control of the situation with professional efficiency. Samuel was subdued and arrested, his followers either surrendering peacefully or being taken into custody for questioning. The compound that had seemed so impregnable hours earlier was quickly transformed into a crime scene where investigators would spend months documenting the full scope of Samuel's operation and identifying all of his victims. As we were escorted to safety, I could see fires burning in some of the compound buildings, set by fanatics who preferred to destroy evidence rather than let authorities discover the full extent of the Fellowship's criminal activities. The aftermath of our rescue involved weeks of debriefing sessions, medical examinations, and legal proceedings as authorities worked to understand the full extent of the Fellowship's criminal activities. Our mother required extensive physical and psychological treatment to recover from her captivity, but she was finally able to tell her complete story without fear of retribution. The compound investigation revealed that Samuel had been operating similar communities in 3 different states, moving operations whenever law enforcement attention grew too intense. Hundreds of victims came forward with stories of abuse, financial exploitation, and forced separation from family members, painting a picture of systematic criminal enterprise that had operated for decades. Samuel Thornfield was charged with kidnapping, assault, tax evasion, human trafficking, and running an illegal organization, facing multiple life sentences that would keep him imprisoned forever. The other fellowship members were treated as victims rather than criminals, with counseling services and relocation assistance provided to help them rebuild their lives outside the cult's influence. Daniel and I testified at Samuel's trial, describing our experience and the systematic way he had manipulated and controlled his followers through isolation, fear, and false promises of spiritual salvation. 6 months later, we visited our mother at the rehabilitation facility, where she was learning to live without the constant fear that had shaped her adult life. She looked healthier than she had in years, and for the first time she was able to talk openly about our father without flinching or changing the subject. She apologized for keeping the truth from us for so long, explaining that she'd hoped we could live normal lives if we never learned about Samuel's existence. The therapy sessions had helped her understand that shame and guilt over her time in the fellowship had prevented her from seeking help earlier, allowing Samuel to maintain his hold over her through fear long after she'd physically escaped. We learned that several other former fellowship members had spent years hiding from Samuel, moving frequently and changing their identities to avoid being tracked down and forced to return. The facility's garden was peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, and as we sat together on a wooden bench, our mother finally explained why she had made us promise never to look for our father, because she knew that Samuel Thornfield's greatest skill was making people believe they wanted exactly what he planned to take from them anyway, and she'd feared that even as adults, we might be vulnerable to the same manipulation that had nearly destroyed her life decades earlier. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.